in the spring of 1887, in the high silver country above Cooper's Reach in the Colorado Territory, a woman of 28 named Della Hart paid $2 for a thing that 4 grown men had already given up on. It was a minecart, an ore car of riveted iron and oak planking rusted the color of dried blood and seized to its own axles, and it sat at the bottom of a played-out drift on the Marigold claim like a tooth no one wished to pull. The men at the assay office had laughed when she counted out her coins. They told her she had bought herself 1,000 pounds of trouble she could not lift, let alone move, and they were not wrong about the weight. What they did not know, what no one in that town knew, was that the cart had been welded shut at one end by a hand that meant it never to be opened, and that the silence sealed inside it had been waiting 11 years for someone with the patience to listen. This is a story about that patience, and about what it costs, and about what it buys in the end. If it moves, you stay with it to the close, where the cart gives up the last of what it held. Della had come to Cooper's Reach with a canvas roll of tools and very little else. Her father, Elias Hart, had been a blacksmith and a fixer of broken iron in a Kansas river town, and he had died the previous autumn of a fever that took him in 9 days. He had left her no land and no money. He had left her the forge skills he had taught her since she was 9 years old, when she had first held the long tongs and felt the heat of the fire against her cheek. He had left her his hammers, his files, his cold chisels, and a flat iron pry bar with a handle worn smooth and dark by his palm. And he had left her one rule she carried like a second name. Work with the grain of the iron, he had told her, not against it. Iron remembers how it was made. Find the place where it wants to give, and it will give. She had no use for those words in Kansas after he was buried, because the men who had brought their broken plows and wagon tires to Elias Hart would not bring them to his daughter. They came the first week out of habit, with their cracked iron and their seized hinges, and they stood in the door of the shop and looked at the girl, at the anvil, and at the fire she had already laid. And they took off their hats and said they were sorry for her loss and that they would wait for a proper smith to come through. She mended a plowshare for one of them anyway, a neighbor who had known her father 30 years, and she mended it well, better than her father might have on a tired day, and the man paid her and thanked her and never came back. It was not that they thought her work was poor. It was that a woman at a forge was a thing they could not make sit right in their minds, and rather than rearrange their minds, they rearranged their custom and took it 12 miles down the river to a man half the smith her father had been. So she sold the anvil she could not carry, and the heavy stock and the cold-bending fixtures, and she kept the hammers and the files and the chisels and the worn pry bar, and she rode west to the Territory, where she had heard there was work for anyone who could mend a thing, and where no one knew enough about her to be sure she could not. She had thought a great deal on that ride about what her father would have said, and she had decided he would have said nothing, because he had not been a man for comfort, only for work, and the comfort he had given her had always come disguised as a task. Find the place where it wants to give, he would have said, and put your weight there. She did not yet know what would give in the Territory. She only knew she would find it by working. What she found in Cooper's Reach was a silver town past its best years, a single crooked street of frame buildings going gray, a stamp mill that ran 3 days a week instead of 6, and a played-out hillside stitched with abandoned claims. She found a room above the livery for $1 a week, a narrow space under the eaves that smelled of hay and horse and held a rope bed and a washstand and nothing else. And on her 3rd day, walking the old workings to learn the country, reading the hillside the way her father had taught her to read a piece of cold iron, she found the Marigold and the cart. The Marigold had been a small claim, worked and abandoned and worked again over the years by men whose names the town had mostly forgotten. The last of them had been a Welsh miner called Tom Penhale, who had held the claim alone for a season in the year 1876 and then had simply gone, owing rent, leaving his cart at the bottom of the drift. That was the story the liveryman told her, the only story anyone seemed to have. Penhale had been a quiet one, the man said, kept to himself, talked to no one, and one morning he was not there and never came back. Folks figured he had jumped his debts and lit out for the Nevada strikes. The cart had sat ever since. Della went down into the drift with a lantern the next morning and looked at the cart for a long time before she touched it. It was a standard ore car, 4 feet long in the box and near as deep, mounted on 4 iron wheels that had rusted to the rails beneath them. The wood of the box had silvered and split. The iron had bloomed with rust in 3 colors, the orange of new oxide, the dark brown of old, and a strange green-black scaling low on the welded end where water had stood. And it was the welded end that made her set down her lantern and crouch and bring her face close. An ore cart is built to dump. The whole purpose of the thing is that it tips and empties and is filled again. This one had been altered. Someone had taken sheet iron and riveted and then welded a false wall across the dumping end, sealing the box into a closed chest. The work was rough, but it was strong. The work of a man who knew a forge and meant the seal to hold. Della ran her father's pry bar along the welded seam and felt where the metal had been worked, and she understood 2 things at once. The first was that a man does not seal an ore cart shut for no reason. The second was that whatever reason he had taken it with him when he went, and it had been sitting in the dark of this drift for 11 years. She paid her $2 to the territory recorder the following Monday because the Marigold had reverted for unpaid assessment and the cart went with the ground. The recorder, a thin, dry man named Auberry, took her coins and made his joke about the 1,000 pounds of trouble and the 2 miners loafing by his stove, laughed along. Della folded her receipt and put it in her satchel and said only that she would manage. She did not tell them about the welded end. She had learned in Kansas that a thing you mean to do is best done before it is announced. What she meant to do was open the cart, not move it. Open it. And to do that she first had to free it from the rails it had rusted to and bring it up the drift to where she could work it in daylight. And that labor alone took her the better part of 2 weeks. The wheels were the worst of it. 11 years of standing water and mineral seep had fused the iron wheels to the iron rails until they were very nearly one piece of metal. Della crouched in the lantern light and studied the seized wheels for the better part of a morning before she lifted a single tool. Because her father had taught her that the man who understands a problem before he strikes it will save himself 3 days of striking. She saw that the rust had grown thickest where the wheel flange met the railhead, a hard scale of red and brown laid down one wet season at a time, and she saw that the bearings beneath were what truly held, the old grease gone to a black varnish that gripped the axle like a fist. Force would only snap her bar or split a wheel. Heat was the answer, the slow argument with the iron that her father had spent his life making. She did not try to break the wheels free by force, because force was not what Elias Hart had taught her. She built a small charcoal fire in an iron bucket and fed it with a length of pipe she breathed through. To raise the heat, and she laid the bucket close against the first seized bearing and let the iron drink the warmth until it could hold no more. Then she quenched it with cold water from her canteen, and the metal hissed and cracked and shed a fine rain of rust scale, and she heated it again. Over and over she did this, 3 days of it, kneeling on the wet stone of the drift floor with the smoke stinging her eyes, working the heat into the seized metal and letting the cold split the rust along the lines where 2 kinds of iron had grown unwillingly into one. She talked to it sometimes low and even, the way her father had talked to a stubborn weld, not because she believed the iron heard her, but because the talking kept her own patience steady through the long, cold hours. On the 3rd day, the near wheel turned a 1/4 inch under her bar and shed a flake of rust the size of her palm, and she sat back on her heels in the lantern light and let herself feel for the first time since Kansas that her hands still knew what they were for. It was a small thing, a 1/4 inch of motion in a wheel no one else in the county thought worth turning. But she had learned at the forge that all large things are made of small motions patiently repeated, and that the quarter-inch was the whole of the work in miniature, the iron remembering at last that it had once been meant to roll. She freed the second wheel that evening, working by lantern long after the light had gone from the drift mouth and the rear pair the next day. And by then her method had become a kind of rhythm, fire and water, and the steady lean of the bar, so that the fourth wheel gave in half the time the first had taken. Then came the harder labor of bringing the cart up the grade. The drift sloped down at better than 1 foot in 10, and the cart, with its sealed iron weight, was more than she could push. So she rigged a block and tackle to a timber set deep in the drift wall, a double pulley she had bought second-hand from the stamp mill for $1, and oiled back to life, working the dried grease out of its sheaves with a heated needle and a rag, until the rope ran smooth through it again. She set the timber as her father would have set an anvil, square and deep and trusted, because a rigging that fails under load does not fail gently, and she had no one above her to haul her out if the cart came down on her in the dark. Then she hauled the cart up the slope a hand's breadth at a time, leaning back against the rope until her heels skidded on the wet stone, and after each pull she reset the timber chock behind the rear wheels so the cart could not roll back upon her while she breathed, and found her grip again. It took her 4 days. Her palms blistered the first day, and the blisters broke the second, and the raw skin beneath wept and stung against the rope. And on the third day she wrapped her hands in strips torn from her spare shirt and went on. Because a smith, who stops for her hands, never finishes anything, and the skin would harden if she let it. By the 4th day the skin had gone hard and pale across her palms, the way her father's had been, and she looked at her own hands in the morning light, and saw his in them. The men who passed the mouth of the drift on their way to the mill watched her at it and shook their heads. One of them, a big man named Coyle, who ran a hoist crew, stopped one evening at the drift mouth and stood with his thumbs in his belt, and told her plainly that she was wasting her life on scrap iron a junk dealer would not haul away for free. He was not cruel about it. That was the thing Della noted and set aside. He said it the way a man states the weather, certain and unbothered, because to Coyle and to the town the worthlessness of the cart was not an opinion but a settled fact, as plain as the played-out hillside above them. He told her he had run hoist for 20 years and had moved more iron out of these mountains than she would see in a lifetime, and that he knew dead weight when he saw it, and that the only thing sealed in an abandoned ore car was a hernia for whoever was fool enough to dig it out. Then he touched his hat, not unkindly, and went on down to the mill, and Della went back to her rope. Della did not argue with him. She had no breath to spare for argument, and besides, she had begun to suspect he was wrong in a way she could not yet prove. Because as she worked the cart up into the light, she had begun to hear it. Not a sound exactly, a sense. When she rocked the cart with her bar to reset a chock, something inside it shifted, slow and heavy and wrong for an empty box, and it did not slide like loose ore. It moved like a thing that had been packed and wedged and meant to stay where it was put. She brought the cart out of the drift mouth on a Tuesday morning in the last week of April, into the thin, bright mountain sun, and for the first time in 11 years, the sealed ore car of the Marigold claim stood in open daylight. Della sat down on a stump and looked at it, and ate a cold biscuit and did not open it that day. She had learned patience the way she had learned everything at the forge, from a man who would not let her rush a weld. The cart had waited 11 years. It could wait until she had rested her hands and studied the seam and decided where the iron wanted to give. That evening, in her room above the livery, an old woman knocked at her door. She was small and bent and dressed in widow's black, gone rusty with age, and she said her name was Sarah Penhale, and that she had heard a woman had bought the Marigold and was digging up Tom's old cart. Della asked her in and gave her the one chair and stood herself by the window. Sarah Penhale was Tom Penhale's mother. She lowered herself into the chair with the care of a body that hurt in every joint, and she kept her hands folded in her lap, and she told her story plainly, without weeping, in the voice of a woman who had told it to herself 10,000 times, and worn all the weeping out of it. She had come out to the territory in the year 1875 to keep house for her son, who had written her that he had found good ground at last, and meant to make them both secure. He had sent her the money for the passage out of his first season's earnings, she said, and she had kept the letter that came with it, and in it he had written that she would never scrub another floor for another woman as long as he drew breath. She had kept his cabin and cooked his meals through that winter and the next spring, and she had watched him go down to the claim before light and come up after dark, season after season, a quiet, hard-working man who owed no one an unkind word. And then, in the June of 1876, her son had not come up from his claim one evening. She had kept his supper warm on the stove until the fire died, and through the night and in the morning she had gone down to the drift herself, and found his tools and his lamp, but not him, and she had never found him again. The town had searched 2 days and then stopped, and within the month the town had told her he had run off from his debts and abandoned his own mother to the poorhouse, because that was a story the man who held his debts had put about, and a poor old woman's word weighed nothing against a rich man's. She had not believed it. She had never believed it. She knew her boy, she said, and a man who would send his mother the price of her passage and the promise of an easy old age does not vanish into the night owing the world money and leave her to the charity of strangers. But she had been a poor old woman with no money and no standing, and the man who held Tom's debts had been the richest man in the county, and there had been nothing she could do but live on in the cabin. He let her keep out of what the town called charity, and grow old, and wait for a truth she had stopped expecting to come. The richest man in the county, she said, had been named Harlan Voss. He had owned the bank and the freight line and a half interest in the stamp mill, and there had not been a transaction in Cooper's Reach in 20 years that did not pass under his hand and leave a little of itself behind. He had held the mortgage on Tom's claim, and the note on Tom's tools, and the lien on the very cart Della had dug out of the ground. When Tom vanished, Voss had foreclosed on everything inside a month, moving with a speed the old woman had thought strange even in her grief, and he had filed papers swearing that Tom Penhale had defaulted and absconded. And on the strength of those papers he had taken the Marigold and 3 other claims that bordered it and rolled them into a single holding he sold 2 years later to a Denver company for a sum the old woman could not name without her voice going unsteady. Voss was dead. Now 8 years dead, gone to his grave respectable and mourned, with a stone over him taller than any other in the Cooper's Reach cemetery, and his name carved on the front of the bank he had built. But the lie he had filed still stood in the territory records, and it stood over Tom Penhale's name, and over hers, and it was the last thing on this earth that bore her son's name at all. Della listened to all of it without speaking. Then she asked the old woman one question. She asked whether Tom Penhale had known how to weld. Sarah Penhale looked up at her, and something moved in the old face that had not moved in a long time. He had been a smith before he was a miner, she said. He had shod horses and mended iron in the old country before ever he swung a pick. Why did she ask? Della told her about the welded end of the cart. She told her that a man does not seal an ore car shut for nothing, and that whatever Tom Penhale had sealed inside it 11 years ago was still there, because she had heard it shift, and that she meant to open the cart and see. She did not promise the old woman anything. She had learned not to promise. But she told her she could come and watch if she wished the morning the seam gave way. It took 3 more days to open it. Della would not cut the weld with a chisel and risk the blade slipping into whatever lay inside, because she did not know how the contents were packed, and a chisel that punched through into the dark might destroy in an instant the very thing the cart had kept for 11 years. Instead, she worked the way her father had taught her, with heat and patience and the grain of the iron. She studied the welded seam first by daylight and then by lantern, reading the run of the old bead, finding the places where Tom Penhale's hand had hurried and the places where it had held steady, because a weld tells on the man who laid it the way handwriting tells on the hand. She built her charcoal fire up against the welded seam in a clay trough she shaped with her own hands to hold the heat close against the iron, and she fed the fire with her breathing pipe until the weld line glowed a dull red along its whole length. Then she let it cool, and heated it again and let it cool. 2 days she did this, working the brittleness into the old weld, because heat applied and withdrawn enough times will tire any iron and make short and weary a bead that was laid down strong, and she meant the seam to be tired before she ever set her bar to it. She did not rush it on the second day, though her hands ached to be done, because rushing was the one sin her father would not forgive at the forge, and she could hear him saying it still, that the iron will tell you when it is ready and not before, and that a smith who cannot wait for the iron has no business at the fire. On the third morning the iron was ready. Sarah Penhale sat on the stump in her rusty black with her hands folded, and a small knot of curious men had gathered at a distance, drawn by 3 days of smoke and the rumor that the strange woman meant to open Tom Penhale's old cart at last. Coyle was among them, standing a little apart with his arms folded. Della paid none of them any mind. She set the edge of her father's pry bar into the heated seam where the bead had run thinnest, and she set her hardened palms upon the smooth, worn handle, and she leaned her whole weight upon it, slow and even and without violence the way she had leaned on the rope in the drift. For a long moment nothing gave. Then the weld let go all at once along its whole tired length, with a sound like a struck bell that rang off the canyon walls and came back to them. Thinned, the false wall fell away against the grass. Cold air came out of the cart, the still trapped air of 11 sealed years, and it carried a smell of old iron and oilcloth and something dry and mineral beneath, a smell of a time before any of them standing there had come to this country. Della did not reach in. She stood back, breathing hard, and let the clean April light fall down into the open box for the first time since a frightened man had sealed it in the summer of 1876. And she looked, and the men who had drifted close to laugh did not laugh. Not one of them. The cart had been a joke in Cooper's Reach for 11 years, and the joke died in their throats when the light went into it. Inside the cart, wrapped in waxed oilcloth gone stiff as board, packed tight so it would not shift, no matter how the cart was handled, was a wooden strongbox bound in iron bands. And lying along the top of it, sealed in a flat tin that had once held tobacco, was a folded sheet of paper that even from where she stood Della could see was covered, edge to edge, in a small, careful hand. She lifted the tin out first. Her fingers were steady. She had not let them be otherwise. She pried the lid and unfolded the paper and read it standing in the April sun with the old woman watching her face. And when she had read it through, once, she read it again, and then she went and crouched in front of Sarah Penhale and put the paper into the old woman's hands and told her what it said, because the old woman's eyes were too far gone to read the small hand for herself. It was a letter, and it was an account, written by Tom Penhale in the June of 1876. He had written it because he was afraid. He had struck a pocket of high silver in the Marigold that spring, a rich seam that assayed far beyond anything the claim had shown before, and he had been fool enough, he wrote, to let Harlan Voss know of it when he came to ask for an extension on his note. Voss had offered to buy the claim outright for 1/10 of what the new seam was worth, and when Tom refused, Voss had grown cold and told him the note would be called in full at the end of the month, knowing Tom could not pay it without selling the very silver the claim now held. Tom had understood then that Voss meant to take the Marigold by paper and call it law, so he had done the only thing a smith could think to do. He had taken the richest of the ore he had pulled, the proof of what the seam truly held, and the assay slips that recorded it, and the original deed to his claim that Voss had been pressing him to surrender, and he had sealed them all inside his own ore cart with a weld, and he had hidden the cart at the bottom of the drift where no one would think to look at a piece of abandoned iron. He had written the letter to say where the truth was and why, in case anything happened to him before he could bring it to the territory seat and file it. Something had happened to him. The letter was the last thing he had done. What had happened to Tom Penhale that June no living person could say for certain, and Della did not pretend to know. The mountains kept their own counsel, and the drifts were deep, and a man working alone could come to grief 100 ways. But the letter ended with a line the old woman made Della read 3 times, in which Tom Penhale wrote that if his mother should ever come to read these words, she was to know that he had not run from her, that he had never in his life meant to leave her, and that everything he had sealed in the iron he had sealed for her sake, so that she would not be left with nothing. Sarah Penhale did not weep when she heard it. She sat very still with the paper in her 2 hands, and after a long while she said only that she had always known her boy had not run. The town had told her he ran for 11 years, and she had carried the knowing that they were wrong like a stone in her chest, alone, and now the stone was a different weight. Della stood and gave her the time, and did not crowd her because she understood that some truths are too large to be met with words, and that the kindest thing is silence held alongside another person until the worst of it has passed. The strong box, when Della lifted it out and pried its lid, held what the letter promised. There was high-grade ore, dark and heavy, and threaded with the bright wire silver that only the richest pockets gave up, more of it than she had ever seen in one place. There were the assay slips, 4 of them stamped and dated in the spring of 1876, recording values that made the loafing men crane their necks. And folded beneath it all, wrapped separately in its own oilcloth, was the original patented deed to the Marigold claim, made out to Thomas Penhale, never surrendered, never sold, bearing a recording date that fell 8 days before Harlan Voss had filed his sworn paper claiming the claim abandoned and in default. 8 days. The deed proved Tom Penhale had held clear title to the Marigold at the very moment Voss swore he had walked away from it. The assay slips proved the claim had been worth a fortune Voss had known of and had sworn was worthless. Scrapped the letter, in Tom's own hand, named the whole of it. Voss had built his fortune and his good name and his respectable grave upon a sworn lie, and the lie had stood 11 years because the only proof against it had been sealed inside a rusted cart that everyone agreed was not worth the iron it was made of. Della Hart was not a lawyer, and she did not pretend to be one. But she knew what physical truth was worth against a paper lie, because her father had taught her that iron remembers how it was made, and she had come to believe that records do too. She did not go to the men loafing at the assay office, and she did not go to the town that had laughed at her. She wrapped the deed and the slips and the letter carefully, and she took the long stage to the territory seat at the county recorder's, and she laid the whole of it before the clerk of records, a careful old man who put on 2 pairs of spectacles to read Tom Penhale's hand, and grew very quiet as he read. Here the story turns, and it turns the way such things truly turn, which is slowly through paper and patience and not through any single dramatic hour. The clerk could not simply undo 11 years with a stroke, but the recording date on the deed was real, and the seal was the territory's own. And once a true deed of earlier date is laid against a sworn claim of abandonment, the sworn claim cannot stand. Wardard went up the chain from the clerk to the county attorney, a younger man with no love for the memory of Harlan Voss, and over the following months the Voss estate's title to the Marigold and the 3 claims around it was examined and found rotten at its root. The Denver company that had bought the consolidated holding from Voss had worked it out years before and moved on, so there was no great mine to take back. What there was, the law could reach. The Voss estate was made to render an accounting, and out of it, by a settlement, The county attorney pressed, and the estate's heirs did not dare to fight once Tom Penhale's letter became known. A sum was set aside and paid over to Sarah Penhale as the heir of Thomas Penhale in restitution for the claim her son had been cheated of. It was not the full fortune the scheme had yielded. Justice come 11 years late is never the whole of what was taken. But it was enough that the old woman who had been kept all those years on what the town called charity would never want again, and it was paid over her son's name, and her son's name was entered clean in the territory record with the lie struck through beside it. Della took nothing from the settlement. She had not done the work for the settlement. When Sarah Penhale pressed her to take a share, Della told her that she had bought a cart for $2 and gotten exactly what she paid for, which was the chance to use her hands on something that mattered, and that this was more than she had been given in Kansas, and she would not spoil it by selling it. What she took instead, at the old woman's insistence, was the high-grade ore from the strongbox, the dark silver-threaded rock that Tom had pulled from the seam, because, Sarah said, a smith ought to have something of weight to remember the work by, and her boy would have liked that. A smith was the one who freed it. Word of the thing got back to Cooper's Reach, as such words do. The recorder, Auberry, who had made his joke about the 1,000 pounds of trouble, did not apologize because men like Auberry seldom do. But he was seen to take off his hat to Della Hart on the street that summer, which from him was a kind of confession. The big man Coyle, who had told her she was wasting her life on scrap iron, came to her one evening with a cracked hoist drum he could find no one to mend, and he set it down and said plainly that he had been wrong about her and that he would be obliged if she would look at his drum. Della looked at it. She mended it. She did not say a word about scrap iron, because the work said it for her, and because her father had taught her that a person who must tell you they were right has not yet understood what being right is for. The town that ran 3 days a week had need of a smith who could mend the unmendable, and the men who would not bring their broken iron to her in the spring brought it to her by the fall, because a played-out silver town cannot afford its pride for long, and because a woman who could raise a sealed card out of a drift and read the truth out of it was plainly a woman who could fix a wagon tire. She took the room above the livery for her own and put her forge in the empty stall below it, and she set her father's hammers and files and cold chisels on the wall where she could reach them, and she hung the worn pry bar in the center where it belonged. Sarah Penhale lived 4 more years. Secure and unafraid, in a small, clean house Della helped her furnish with the settlement money, and when she died she left Della the one thing she had left to leave, which was the tin that had held the letter. Della kept it on the shelf above her forge. The cart itself she did not sell for scrap, though a junk dealer offered her more for it now that its story was known than she had paid for the whole claim. She had the false welded wall struck off, and the box made whole again, and she set the cart in the yard beside her forge, and she planted it with earth, and grew marigolds in it for the claim, and for the old woman, and for the man who had sealed the truth inside iron and trusted that iron would keep it until the right hand came. In the high country summers the flowers burned a bright, hard orange against the rusted box, the brightest thing in the yard, and travelers passing through Cooper's Reach would sometimes ask the smith about the strange planter, the old ore cart full of flowers, and why a working woman kept such a thing. Della Hart would set down her hammer and wipe her hands and tell them, if they had the time to hear it, that she had once paid $2 for a thing 4 men had given up on, and that the men had laughed, and that the laughing had been the cheapest part of the price. She would tell them that her father had taught her to work with the grain of the iron and not against it, because iron remembers how it was made, and will give at last to a patient hand. And she would tell them that a truth is no different, that it can be sealed in the dark and forgotten and laughed over for 11 years, and still be waiting, whole and cold and exactly as it was left, for someone with the patience to listen for the place where it wants to give. Then she would pick up her hammer again, and the travelers would go on their way, and the marigolds would burn in the rusted iron behind her, and the worn handle of her father's pry bar would catch the late light on the wall, just where she could reach it. If you have ever known a truth that the world refused to hear and held it alone and waited, I would be glad to know you were here. And if a story of patience and the things buried iron can keep stays with you, there is another like it waiting for whenever you are ready to listen.